Well, Neil James is the Executive Director of the Australia Defence Association, and he's previously visited troops in Afghanistan, and he joins me now live from Canberra. Neil James, the Prime Minister, saying that this is our single worst day in Afghanistan and the most losses in combat since the Battle of Long Tan in Vietnam. Certainly very sobering news for the Australian Defence Force.
Look, it certainly is, Kim. I mean, we've had mass casualty situations before, like the Black Hawk crash at High Range a few years back, but it is the first large number of combat deaths on the same day in a very long time.
One of these incidents, of course, was where a man dressed in an Afghan army uniform has opened fire, shot and killed 3 Australian soldiers, wounded 2 others, a so-called green on blue killing. This is not the first time this has happened to Australian troops. A lot of force protection measures have been put in. Are they simply not good enough to counter something like this?
Look, the real problem here, and I think too many people in Australia are asking the wrong question about this, is that this is an integral part of the job. You can't mentor and train people without living with them. That requires an element of two-way trust, and occasionally that trust breaks down. It's impossible to stop these type of incidents totally. You can mitigate the risk, but they are impossible to stop. But a lot of the questions today have been based on the assumption that there's something else that we could be doing. Now, the Defence Association doesn't think that's true. We have full faith in the people on the ground in Afghanistan. It's not as if they take a cavalier approach to the operational security and the well-being of the people in their own team. This is unfortunately just an inevitable tragedy of the type of war we're fighting there.
7 Australian troops have been killed in these so-called green on blue incidents now during the Afghanistan war. The chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, has been visiting Afghanistan, also expressing concern about American soldiers coming under these sorts of attacks. Do you just think that perhaps the nature of the conflict in Afghanistan is changing a little bit, and as this transition of power, this handover of security responsibility, that this has become one of the biggest hurdles that our forces, coalition troops too, face?
Well, that's certainly true to a fair extent. I mean, you know, all wars are dynamic to some extent. Obviously, enemy tactics change and our tactics change over time, and it's because of the success that the Afghan and coalition forces have had against the Taliban that the Taliban has resorted to this tactic. So, to an extent, it's perhaps a sign of weakness on their part rather than strength. But the bottom line here is a simple one, and that is there is no alternative. This war can only be won in the long run by the Afghans, and they have to be got to the stage where they can take over completely. So they have to be mentored and trained, and there's no alternative to doing that. So the idea that we can suddenly solve this problem, for example, by not training them or by quitting Afghanistan just isn't a viable alternative.
Were you reassured to hear the Prime Minister there speaking from the Cook Islands, asked a question about whether she was contemplating any change to the Australian mission, and she simply said, "No, I am not"?
Well, I think both the Prime Minister and the Governor-General have made the point about resolve. The moment the nation commits its forces to a war, you have to fight it. It's not something that you can suddenly decide you're going to participate in or not participate in on a daily basis. Now, Australia in all its wars has shown resolve. The resolve of some of our coalition partners might be weakening to some extent, but we would hope that wouldn't happen to Australia, or we shouldn't be there in the first place. And the bottom line here, of course, again, is that it's not a great time to discuss whether we should be there or not when we've just lost 5 soldiers, because the argument over the next few days will be emotive, and we're better off having a decision on our Afghan policy next week or the week after, when everyone have cooled down a bit.
Certainly the Prime Minister says that this news is very, very shocking, and she's acknowledged that some members of the public would ask, why is Australia still there? Can't we bring people home? But she was also stressing that that's her job then to explain why Australia is there and why the mission is important. Let me ask you about carrying out that mission, because the Acting Chief of the Defence Force said that morale would take a hit. Yeah. The Prime Minister says that trust will be corroded. How do our troops recover and restore that trust with their Afghan counterparts?
Well, it's very difficult, as it has been with all the previous incidents, and the VCDF made the quite logical point that the Afghans that we're working with are as horrified by this as our people are. The big problem in this incident is in previous incidents there were additional extra things that might have helped, that could be done, and they have been done. The problem now, of course, from the morale point of view, is that we've pretty much done everything we can do, and so there isn't the psychological comfort of instituting additional measures. And obviously morale will take some careful nurturing in that regard. But these are professional soldiers. They know they've got a job to do. They know there's no alternative. And they just have to work through the tragedy. I mean, the Army isn't exactly unaccustomed at having to cope with tragedy and death. And it's never great when members of a team lose members of their team. But I keep coming back to this point. There is no alternative, certainly not in the short term. And Australia and the diggers on the ground are just going to have to persist.
And this is a reminder of the service that they give. Neil James from the Australia Defence Association, thank you very much for joining us from Canberra this afternoon.
Thank you, Kim.